My name is Emily Carlson, and I never thought the person I trusted most in my own family could become the source of my worst nightmare. It started so quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the softest whisper at the edge of my awareness, but it built into something I could no longer ignore. My sister, Lauren, the one I had shared every childhood secret with, had begun poisoning my water. And everyone around me, my parents, cousins, even some friends, kept urging me to stay silent, to keep the family together, as if my suffering could be erased with a smile and a nod. At first, I questioned myself constantly, wondering if it was all in my imagination. But when the blood test came back, the truth was undeniable, and the betrayal hit deeper than anything I could have imagined. I had always believed family was a sanctuary, but for me, that sanctuary had become a cage of deception, manipulation, and danger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It all began when I moved back home to Cedarwood, a quiet town in Pennsylvania after finishing college in Boston. I thought returning would be a peaceful reprieve from the chaos of city life, a chance to reset, reconnect, and finally heal from years of stress and uncertainty. My parents' house, with its peeling white paint and overgrown garden, held memories of simpler times. Bike rides down Maple Street, warm summers on the back porch, and Christmas mornings filled with laughter and cinnamon rolls. But soon after my return, subtle changes began to unsettle me. I started feeling unusually fatigued, as if a heavy fog had settled over my body and mind. Headaches came and went with alarming frequency, and my stomach would churn unpredictably. At first, I brushed it off as stress or the adjustment to living back in a small town. But deep down, I sensed something darker was at play. Lauren had always been the more volatile of the two of us. Growing up, she had a charm that drew people in, but also a streak of selfishness and a need for control that sometimes made our parents tiptoe around her moods. I had learned to coexist with it, keeping my distance when necessary, but always believing that at the core she loved me. Yet there was something different now. She smiled at me with that familiar warmth, but there was a calculated coldness behind her eyes, a subtle intensity in her gaze that made my skin crawl. The first incident that made me suspicious wasn't dramatic. A glass of water I had left untouched on the kitchen counter that tasted faintly metallic, a taste I couldn't place. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe I was imagining things. But the next day, the headaches returned with a vengeance, and the nausea hit so hard that I spent hours curled up on the bathroom floor. I started paying closer attention, taking mental notes of patterns and coincidences. Every time I filled my water bottle, the symptoms intensified over the next few hours. My intuition screamed that something was wrong, yet when I voiced my concerns, my family's response was disorienting. "Don't make waves, Emily," my mother said softly, avoiding eye contact. "Family sticks together. Don't ruin the peace over nothing." My father, usually more straightforward, nodded in agreement, but added, "Sometimes you read too much into things. Just relax." It was baffling. How could they dismiss what I was feeling so casually? It was as if they had already made their choice, prioritizing the illusion of harmony over my well-being. The tension with Lauren was nearly imperceptible at first, but it grew in a subtle, almost maddening way. She would linger near the kitchen sink when I filled my bottle, hovering just long enough for me to feel watched. Sometimes she would insist on refilling my glass herself, smiling innocently, insisting she was just being helpful. I felt trapped between disbelief and fear, uncertain if my suspicions were paranoia or reality. My friends noticed my change in behavior too. Calls from my college friends brought concerned questions. "You don't sound like yourself, Emily. Are you okay?" I forced reassurances, careful not to reveal the true source of my distress. Because in my family, discussing discomfort or suspicion was always discouraged. One evening, after another bout of overwhelming fatigue, I made a decision. I had to take matters into my own hands. If my family wouldn't listen, if they refused to acknowledge the danger, I needed proof.
I started documenting everything, the exact times I drank water, the symptoms that followed, even subtle changes in taste or odor. I took photographs of my glassware, noting when Lauren had touched them, and kept a small journal, desperate to make sense of what was happening. It was a painstaking process, and every entry I wrote made me feel both vulnerable and determined. I couldn't rely on intuition alone. I needed science, something undeniable. The first real confirmation came when I scheduled a comprehensive blood test at Cedarwood Medical Clinic. Sitting in the sterile white room, the hum of fluorescent lights above me, I felt a mixture of anxiety and relief. Here was a chance to finally validate my fears, or at the very least, to confront them with concrete evidence. When the nurse drew my blood, I felt a pang of vulnerability, my body betraying the anxiety swirling in my mind. I knew that what came next would change everything.
Even as I left the clinic, clutching the small stack of paperwork and instructions for follow-up, a part of me braced for the family's reaction. If the results confirmed what I suspected, the world I had known, the safe cocoon of home, the unspoken rules of silence, the trust in my sister, would be irrevocably shattered. But deep down, I also felt a surge of clarity and determination. Whatever the outcome, I knew I had to confront the truth, even if it meant standing alone. I had lived long enough under the shadow of uncertainty, and now the story of betrayal, deception, and courage was about to unfold in ways I could not yet imagine. After that first terrifying visit to the clinic, life at home became an exercise in careful observation and quiet suspicion. Cedarwood had always seemed like a safe, almost sleepy town, but now my own house felt like a minefield. My parents continued to urge me towards silence, framing their warnings as concern for family unity. "Some things are better left unsaid, Emily," my mother would say, her voice soft but firm, as if speaking too loudly about a problem might summon it into reality. My father would nod solemnly, adding, "You have to pick your battles carefully. Family is complicated, and sometimes keeping peace is more important than proving a point." I wanted to scream, to demand that they see what was happening. But I knew that confrontation without proof would only make them defensive and deepen the wall of secrecy. Instead, I began to observe Lauren more closely, recording behaviors, noting every odd glance, every lingering movement near my water or food. Lauren's actions became increasingly calculated. She seemed to know which moments to strike, subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, but consistent enough to create noticeable effects. At first, it was small. A glass of water I left on the counter would have an unusual metallic taste. A bottle in the fridge would disappear or reappear, partially emptied, sometimes with a faint residue at the bottom that looked out of place. She never touched my food directly, or at least I couldn't prove that she did, but the pattern with liquids was undeniable. I started to feel a sense of paranoia creeping in, my nerves constantly on edge. I became hyper-aware of every kitchen visit, every offer of help from Lauren, every innocent suggestion from my parents to drink more water or relax. Each gesture, no matter how mundane it seemed, carried the weight of potential danger. The psychological toll was immense. I had spent years believing that my home would be a sanctuary, but now I questioned every interaction. I began sleeping with a small notebook beside my bed, jotting down symptoms, times, and potential triggers. The headaches, nausea, and fatigue were no longer random. They followed a pattern that matched the water I drank, and the intensity escalated if I consumed anything in my glass after Lauren had been near it. I tried to discuss it with friends discreetly, framing it as a weird coincidence, but even they seemed hesitant to intervene. My life had become a constant balancing act, gathering evidence without alerting Lauren, staying healthy enough to function, and managing the emotional weight of betrayal by someone I had once trusted unconditionally. One evening, as rain pounded against the windows, I found myself alone in the kitchen, a glass of water trembling slightly in my hand. Lauren had just returned from an evening out, claiming to have picked up groceries, and my gut screamed that the timing of her return was deliberate. I set the glass down carefully, observing her from across the room. She moved with a casual grace, chatting about her day, her tone light and unconcerned, but every movement was calculated. She reached for the fridge, humming softly, and in that moment, I realized how precise her manipulation had become. This wasn't carelessness or malice born from a single bad day. It was deliberate, systematic, and frighteningly consistent. I knew then that I had to approach this scientifically, that intuition alone would never be enough. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I began to research water contamination and toxicology, learning about common compounds that could induce fatigue, nausea, or dizziness over time. I found myself comparing each symptom against potential substances, noting the gradual progression of my condition and the sudden spikes that coincided with certain times of day. The more I learned, the more I realized how difficult it would be to confront Lauren or my family without concrete proof. Even as my body weakened, my determination strengthened. I had always been careful, methodical, and resilient, and now those traits became essential for my survival and my pursuit of the truth. As the days passed, the tension at home thickened. Family dinners, once warm and predictable, turned into exercises in vigilance. I sat quietly, carefully monitoring every interaction, every comment, every glance exchanged between Lauren and my parents. Occasionally, my mother would make a small, almost apologetic gesture, a hand on my shoulder, a whispered caution, but she never directly addressed my concerns. I realized that their insistence on silence wasn't born of ignorance, but of complicity, or at the very least, a willingness to avoid discomfort at the expense of truth. It was a bitter revelation that left me feeling isolated, yet also steeled my resolve.
One critical evening, after another bout of severe nausea left me hunched over the kitchen counter, I decided to take a precautionary step. I purchased a personal water filter and a set of sealed glass bottles to monitor any potential contamination. For the first time, I drank water that had not passed through the house's main faucet or come near Lauren. Within hours, the fog lifted slightly, my stomach calmed, and a sharp clarity returned to my thoughts. The difference was undeniable. I had objective, repeatable evidence that something in the household water, or something Lauren was introducing, was affecting me. It was subtle, but it was irrefutable. The next morning, as I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh notebook and a filtered bottle of water, I began to realize the enormity of what I was facing. Confronting Lauren would be dangerous without proof. Going to my parents would likely be futile without hard evidence. My options were limited, and each one carried risk. But there was no turning back. I had begun to gather the pieces of a puzzle that could finally expose the truth, and I understood that every careful observation, every logged symptom, and every cautious step forward was bringing me closer to undeniable validation. In that moment, I felt a strange mixture of fear and empowerment. Fear of what might happen if the truth emerged, and empowerment in knowing that I was finally taking control. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a small measure of hope. The path ahead would be treacherous, but at least I had clarity. I was no longer a passive victim of circumstances or deception. I had begun a journey that would uncover the hidden reality in my own home, and nothing, not fear, not family pressure, not Lauren's cunning, would stop me from seeking justice and protection for myself. The breaking point came unexpectedly, in the middle of a warm, sunny afternoon that should have felt ordinary, almost serene. I had returned from a short run through Cedarwood's quiet streets, a habit I had picked up to try and maintain some semblance of normalcy and strength despite the constant fog of fatigue that had settled over me. My legs ached, my chest burned from exertion, but more than that, my mind was tense, preoccupied with the ongoing calculations of how to catch Lauren in the act without tipping her off. When I stepped into the kitchen and reached for my filtered water bottle, I noticed immediately that something was off. The cap had been removed,
The bottle shifted slightly to one side, and the faint metallic tang I had grown all too familiar with tickled my senses. My heart pounded, adrenaline spiking as I realized that Lauren had accessed my protective water supply, a bold move that suggested increasing confidence or recklessness. I didn't confront her immediately. Instead, I pulled on a pair of gloves, retrieved a clean glass from a locked cabinet, and carefully poured the liquid into the glass. My hands trembled as I examined the faint residue clinging to the bottom of the bottle, a subtle, almost imperceptible cloud that had never been there before. I didn't need to be a chemist to know that whatever it was, it had the power to make me seriously ill. For the first time, fear took root in a physical way. Tightness in my chest, my throat constricting, my stomach twisting into knots. This was no longer a quiet game of paranoia or suspicion. It was active, deliberate, and dangerous. I had to act quickly, but I also knew that acting without evidence could escalate everything beyond repair. The decision to go back to the clinic and request a specialized blood test came suddenly, like a spark igniting a fire in my mind. I couldn't rely on the standard panels anymore. I needed targeted analysis for toxins, heavy metals, and any foreign compounds that could explain the sharp swings in my health. Scheduling the test was nerve-wracking. I had to avoid alerting Lauren while also ensuring the lab staff understood the urgency and specificity of the request. Sitting in the waiting room, I noticed other patients chatting casually, oblivious to the storm that was brewing in my own home. I felt isolated and hyper-aware, my nerves taut with anxiety and anticipation. It was a strange mixture of fear and hope. Fear of what might happen if the truth emerged, and hope that finally I would have something undeniable. While waiting for the test results, the household tension escalated. Lauren seemed to sense a shift in my behavior, her movements more deliberate, her comments sharper. One evening, I returned from a short trip to the grocery store to find her standing in the kitchen, arms crossed, a smirk playing at the edges of her lips. "You've been drinking that fancy bottled water a lot lately," she said, her voice casual but dripping with an edge I couldn't ignore. I swallowed, pretending to ignore the implied threat, but inside, panic bubbled. This was no longer subtle contamination. This was psychological warfare layered on top of physical harm. Every interaction, every glance, every seemingly innocent gesture carried weight, and I knew I had to remain vigilant. At night, I scoured online forums and toxicology guides, cross-referencing symptoms with potential compounds that might be used to induce gradual illness. The more I researched, the more horrifying the possibilities became. Some chemicals were virtually undetectable without specialized testing. Some had delayed effects, and all could cause cumulative damage over time. The thought that Lauren could have chosen any of these substances, targeting me with precision, made my stomach churn. The logical side of my brain urged patience, meticulous documentation, and absolute care. But the emotional side was screaming for confrontation, for justice, for relief. I felt trapped between the need for evidence and the urge to defend myself immediately.
The pivotal moment arrived one morning when my fatigue turned into something more alarming. I awoke dizzy, barely able to stand, and felt a sudden, sharp pain in my abdomen that sent me to the bathroom clutching my stomach. My hands shook as I leaned against the sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror, realizing that this was no longer just mild poisoning or discomfort. It was escalating dangerously. I could hear Lauren moving around the house, humming softly, completely unaware or deliberately ignoring the chaos she was causing. I realized in that instant that waiting passively was no longer an option. If I didn't take definitive action, I could end up severely ill or worse. Summoning every ounce of courage, I called the clinic to request an emergency appointment, explaining my symptoms and emphasizing the urgent need for comprehensive toxicology screening. The nurse on the line sensed the seriousness of my voice and expedited the process, setting me up for immediate testing. As I prepared to leave the house, I felt a mix of fear and resolve, unlike anything I had experienced before. This was the moment that would determine everything, whether my suspicions were dismissed as paranoia
or confirmed as a terrifying reality. I packed my bag with water that I knew was uncontaminated, wore gloves, and moved quietly through the house, acutely aware of every sound, every shadow. Driving to the clinic, I reflected on how fragile the illusion of safety had been. Returning home after college had felt like coming back to a place of comfort, a reprieve from the chaos of the outside world. Instead, I had stepped into a carefully concealed web of betrayal, manipulation, and danger. I thought of my parents, who had insisted on silence, and I felt a mixture of frustration and sorrow. Their desire for peace had inadvertently left me vulnerable, forcing me to rely entirely on my own intuition, diligence, and courage. Sitting in the lab, watching the technicians prepare my samples, I realized that this was the point of no return. Whatever the results revealed, I could no longer remain passive. My life, my health, and my sanity were at stake, and the truth had to come out. For the first time, the fear that had gripped me since noticing the first odd taste in my water was paired with a fierce determination. I was no longer just a victim of circumstances. I was an active participant in uncovering the hidden reality in my own home, ready to face whatever consequences awaited. The blood test would either confirm my worst fears or offer relief. But either way, my life was about to change irrevocably. The day the lab results came back is a day I will never forget. My hands shook as I tore open the sealed envelope, my pulse pounding so loudly I thought it might echo in the quiet of my bedroom. Every part of me wanted to deny what I was about to read, to tell myself it was a mistake, a clerical error, or some anomaly in the testing process. But as I scanned the report, my eyes widened in horror. The presence of a toxic substance, one that was rare and highly potent, had been detected at alarming levels in my bloodstream. The pattern and concentration left no room for ambiguity. It had been introduced gradually, deliberately, and consistently. For the first time, the invisible threat that had shadowed every day since moving home was validated by undeniable objective evidence. I was not imagining things. I was not paranoid. My sister, my own blood, had been poisoning me. For a moment, I simply sat on the edge of my bed, the envelope trembling in my hands, unable to breathe. My mind raced, piecing together the months of subtle sickness, the patterns of her behavior, the inexplicable fatigue and nausea that had haunted me. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with a terrifying clarity. Every casual offer of water, every lingering glance near the kitchen sink, every suggestion from my parents to stay calm or not make waves suddenly carried a weight I could no longer ignore. This was no longer a quiet domestic conflict or sibling rivalry. It was a deliberate, calculated attempt on my health, my life even, and the people around me had chosen inaction over intervention. I knew immediately that I could not confront Lauren alone, not without external support. I reached for my phone, dialing my friend and former roommate Megan, who had a sharp mind and an uncanny ability to remain calm in crises. When she answered, I could barely form coherent sentences, my voice breaking under the weight of revelation. Megan, I think my sister, she's been poisoning me, I said finally, the words tasting strange and heavy on my tongue. There was a long silence on the other end, punctuated only by the faint hum of her city apartment in the background. Emily, slow down, she said gently but firmly. Tell me everything from the beginning. We'll figure this out. For the first time, I felt a sliver of hope. The evidence was no longer confined to my own suspicions. It was real, documented, undeniable, and capable of being verified by someone outside my family.
That evening, armed with my blood test results and detailed logs of symptoms and incidents, I approached my parents for a conversation I had long feared. My heart hammered in my chest as I laid the evidence on the kitchen table, every movement deliberate, controlled. I have proof now, I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. This isn't paranoia.
I've been poisoned, and it's consistent with everything I suspected. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the envelope, her face pale. My father leaned back in his chair, jaw tight, eyes darted to Lauren, who had suddenly appeared in the doorway, expression neutral, but sharp. For a moment, silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Lauren's reaction was almost imperceptible at first, a faint narrowing of her eyes, the slightest tension in her jaw, but it was enough to confirm what I had suspected all along. This was no accident, no fleeting lapse in judgment. She had planned and executed this slowly, and she had relied on my family's silence to cover it. I could see it in her posture, the controlled calm that barely masked the storm beneath. My parents were caught between instinctive denial and the undeniable truth in my hands. Their initial instinct was to minimize, to redirect blame, to preserve the fragile facade of unity. But even they could not ignore the objective proof staring back at them. After a tense pause, my mother finally spoke, her voice quiet and unsteady. "Emily, we didn't want to believe it. We thought maybe you were imagining things or that it was a misunderstanding." Her words trailed off, and I realized they were not excuses. They were confessions of fear, guilt, and complicity. My father added, "We wanted to protect you, protect the family. We thought if we ignored it, it might go away." It was a bitter realization that their desire for peace had nearly cost me everything. I swallowed the anger and fear pooling in my chest, recognizing that they had been trapped by their own denial, and that now the responsibility to act rested squarely on my shoulders. The conversation shifted quickly to logistics. With Megan's guidance over the phone, we discussed next steps, securing my living space, avoiding further contamination, and contacting professionals who could intervene safely. I realized that the initial step had to be involving an objective third party, someone trained to handle domestic poisoning cases without bias. A private investigator and a toxicology consultant were identified as essential to document the evidence officially. Each step required careful planning. Even Lauren, now fully aware that her secret had been exposed to both me and my parents, maintained a calm facade. But I could sense the subtle tension radiating from her, a quiet acknowledgement that her control over the situation was slipping. That night, I documented everything again in my notebook, detailing the symptoms, dates, times, and interactions with my sister and parents. The process, once solitary and isolating, now felt strategic and empowering. I was no longer simply enduring a silent attack. I was systematically preparing to confront it with facts, evidence, and professional support. For the first time, the overwhelming fear that had haunted me since noticing the first metallic taste in my water was tempered with resolve. The truth was finally out in the open, undeniable and visible, and the path forward, though daunting, was clear. By the time I went to bed, exhausted but determined, I understood that the battle had shifted. The initial stage of suspicion and private observation had ended. Now, external eyes had seen the truth. The poison was no longer invisible, the symptoms were no longer dismissed, and the stakes had been formally recognized. Whatever came next, confrontation, investigation, fallout, it would happen with the undeniable authority of evidence, a shield that could protect me from both disbelief and continued harm. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a measure of control returning to my life, however tenuous it might be. The real fight was just beginning, but at least it was a fight I was prepared to face. The days that followed the revelation were a whirlwind of tension, calculation, and internal struggle. I had expected some relief once my parents and I acknowledged the truth, but instead, a new, more insidious challenge emerged.
navigating the mounting opposition, both overt and subtle, from Lauren and even the lingering family pressure to stay quiet. Her demeanor shifted, moving from controlled calm to quiet antagonism, a simmering undercurrent that hinted at her growing awareness of the threat I now posed to her carefully maintained control. Even in casual interactions, the way she stood near me, the almost imperceptible tightening of her grip on objects, the way she monitored what I drank or ate, it all carried a silent message. She would not go down without a fight, and she had already begun plotting her response. I felt that internal conflict gnawing at me constantly. Part of me wanted to scream, to confront her immediately, to demand an apology and an explanation, to reclaim my sense of security and trust. Another part of me, the part honed by weeks of observation and careful documentation, urged patience, strategy, and restraint. Acting impulsively could provoke retaliation, deepen danger, and even weaken the case I was building for objective authorities. Every day became a delicate balancing act, a tightrope walk between gathering evidence and maintaining my physical and mental well-being. Even the simplest household activities were fraught with caution. Preparing meals, filling water bottles, and even stepping into the shower required vigilance, as I could no longer assume the safety of anything in my home.
I began implementing additional measures to monitor potential contamination. I installed small, discreet cameras in common areas, recording everything without alerting Lauren. I purchased sealed, laboratory-grade containers for food and water, carefully labeling each with dates and times. Every meal I consumed outside the house, every beverage I drank was meticulously logged, creating a growing archive of observable patterns and anomalies. I had become part detective, part scientist, and part strategist, and the weight of responsibility pressed on me constantly. Every decision mattered. Every slip could have serious consequences. Lauren's behavior escalated, subtly but unmistakably, during this period. She began leaving cryptic notes around the house, ostensibly benign but layered with passive-aggressive undertones. A cup I had left on the counter would mysteriously vanish for a few hours before reappearing in a slightly different location, or my belongings would be moved just enough to unsettle me. There were moments when she would hover near the kitchen sink while I was preparing water or food, offering unsolicited advice or casual commentary about my habits. The psychological pressure was relentless, and I noticed that even my parents, while no longer dismissive, sometimes seemed caught between their desire to protect me and a lingering fear of Lauren's wrath. It became clear that the opposition I faced was not just her alone. The household dynamic had shifted into a tense, almost militarized environment, with Lauren maneuvering subtly to maintain control while I fought to reclaim safety. The rising opposition intensified when I sought outside professional guidance. Megan helped me identify a toxicologist who specialized in cases of chronic poisoning. Contacting this professional was nerve-wracking. I had to frame the situation carefully, providing enough information to convey urgency without compromising my safety or alerting Lauren. The first consultation was both illuminating and terrifying. The toxicologist explained the precise dangers of the substance detected in my blood, how it could have long-term effects on organ function, neurological health, and overall vitality. They confirmed that chronic, low-level exposure could easily be misinterpreted as fatigue, stress, or a minor illness, an explanation that resonated all too well with my family's initial dismissal. The information was validating, but it also made the stakes terrifyingly real. Even with professional advice, the opposition was relentless. Lauren, aware that my family now recognized my suspicions, adapted her tactics. She became more subtle, more calculated. The previous overt gestures were replaced by nearly invisible manipulations. Small quantities of water diverted into her own bottle, subtle shifts in household dynamics, an undercurrent of intimidation in casual conversations. I realized that the challenge now was not just proving the poisoning, it was navigating an environment where every action could provoke retaliation, and where psychological warfare had become as potent as physical danger. In the midst of this rising pressure, I faced the hardest internal battle, deciding how far I was willing to go and who I could trust. My parents were supportive but cautious, always urging diplomacy and patience. Megan was a steady anchor, offering both emotional support and strategic guidance, but the isolation remained. I couldn't share these moments freely with anyone else as fear of exposure, misunderstanding, or disbelief lingered like a shadow. Every day I woke up calculating risks, monitoring behaviors, analyzing patterns. The tension became a constant companion, shaping my thoughts and actions, influencing even the smallest choices. Despite the pressure, a sense of determination began to crystallize. The evidence I had gathered, my logs, the cameras, the blood tests, and the professional consultation, formed a mounting case that was no longer based solely on suspicion. I had entered a phase of truth-seeking that was deliberate and methodical, a process that strengthened my resolve and sharpened my focus. Each day brought more clarity about the strategy needed to confront Lauren safely, protect myself, and ultimately expose the danger to those who could intervene effectively. I realized that this phase, the gathering of evidence and rising opposition, was the crucible in which my courage and resolve would be tested. The more Lauren tried to undermine me with subtle manipulations, the stronger my determination became to document, validate, and ultimately reveal the truth. Every symptom, every suspicious action, every passive-aggressive interaction became a piece of a larger puzzle that I was slowly, meticulously assembling. And though fear and tension were constant companions, I began to understand that the truth, once fully documented and undeniable, would be a force far stronger than any deception or intimidation Lauren could muster. By the end of this week, I had transformed my household into a controlled environment, a laboratory of careful observation and documentation. Every movement, every drink, every conversation was scrutinized, logged, and analyzed. The opposition was real, constant, and growing more sophisticated. But so was my strategy. I had entered the rising phase of the battle, where patience, intelligence, and resilience became my weapons. And in the midst of it all, a quiet, unshakable certainty settled in my chest. The truth would come out, and when it did, the careful manipulations, threats, and denials could no longer hold sway over reality.
The moment of undeniable proof arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon, a day that started like any other, but ended with a revelation that would change everything. I had spent the morning meticulously preparing samples of water from various sources in the house, my filtered bottles, the kitchen tap, even a glass left untouched for hours on the counter. I had learned to be methodical, almost obsessive, measuring, labeling, and sealing each container to prevent any chance of contamination. Megan had guided me in creating a chain of custody, ensuring that any professional evaluation of these samples could be verified beyond dispute. By noon, I had a small box packed with vials and a lab report from the blood test carefully enclosed, ready to be taken to the toxicologist who had agreed to consult further. The lab was quiet, a sterile white space filled with the low hum of machinery and the occasional beep of monitors. As I handed over the samples, the technician's eyebrows raised slightly, the first sign that even someone unconnected to my situation recognized the unusual nature of what I was presenting. The toxicologist arrived shortly thereafter, a calm, professional presence, who immediately set to work reviewing my documentation, cross-referencing blood test results with the collected water samples.
I watched closely, heart hammering as she handled the vials with precision. Every movement felt significant. Every glance exchanged seemed loaded with unspoken meaning. I had waited months for this moment, and now, as the analysis began, the weight of anticipation pressed down like a physical force. When she looked up from the microscope, her expression was serious, but controlled. Emily, the results confirm what your blood test suggested, she said, her voice steady. The water in your household contains a substance consistent with chronic poisoning. The levels are significant enough to account for the symptoms you've been experiencing, and the distribution across multiple samples indicates deliberate introduction rather than accidental contamination. My stomach lurched, part fear, part relief. Fear, because the reality of what I had suspected was now scientifically confirmed, and relief because the truth was no longer just a suspicion, no longer just intuition. It was objective, measurable, and undeniable. For the first time, the invisible threat that had haunted every meal, every drink, every moment at home had concrete form. I could point to the evidence and say without equivocation that my sister's actions had put me in serious danger. Every headache, every wave of nausea, every day spent in a haze of fatigue suddenly took on a horrifying clarity. The months of uncertainty, of questioning my own perceptions, of facing my family's insistence on silence had culminated in this incontrovertible proof. I felt a mixture of vindication, terror, and an almost overwhelming surge of empowerment. The poison that had sapped my body and mind could now be exposed, and the carefully maintained veil of denial could finally be torn away. Returning home that evening, I carried the weight of knowledge like a shield and a sword. The rain had softened to a light drizzle, and the streetlights cast reflections on the wet pavement that mirrored the storm of thoughts swirling through my mind. I knew I had to prepare for confrontation. This was no longer speculation or private observation. The truth had become a weapon, and I had to wield it strategically. I reviewed my notes again, aligning symptoms with dates, times, and the locations of water use, reinforcing the narrative that would soon be undeniable in the eyes of any authority or mediator I involved. Every step I had taken, the secret logging of symptoms, the careful collection of water samples, the discreet consultation with professionals, had led to this moment of clarity. The next morning, I approached my parents, who had gradually come to understand the seriousness of the situation, but still grappled with disbelief and fear of family upheaval. I laid the updated lab results in front of them, the graphs, charts, and expert notes spread across the kitchen table like evidence in a courtroom. My mother's hands shook as she touched the documents, a mixture of guilt, fear, and sorrow etched across her face. My father's brow furrowed deeply, his lips pressed into a tight line, but even he could not argue against the scientific authority in front of him. The weight of undeniable proof had shifted the balance. There was no longer room for doubt, for minimization, or for polite dismissal. The facts demanded acknowledgement, and they had been delivered with precision and authority. Lauren, of course, was present during the discussion. Her composure, a carefully maintained mask that did little to conceal the tension radiating from her posture. The subtle microexpressions, the tightening of her jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes betrayed the realization that her carefully orchestrated deception had been uncovered. The tables had turned. For months, she had relied on subtlety, manipulation, and the silence of others to maintain control, but now the proof was objective, scientific, and incontrovertible. Every plan she had counted on to evade detection was unraveling before her eyes, and she knew it. By evening, I began to feel a cautious sense of empowerment. The undeniable proof had changed the dynamic entirely. Where once I had been vulnerable, uncertain, and isolated, I now had leverage. I could move forward with a strategy grounded in reality, not conjecture. I could involve authorities, professionals, and allies without fear of being dismissed or misunderstood. The shadow of doubt that had loomed over every sip of water, every interaction with Lauren, had finally lifted, replaced by clarity and purpose. This was the turning point. The poison, the secrecy, and the manipulation had been exposed, and the path forward, though fraught with challenges, was now illuminated by evidence that could not be ignored. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a breath that wasn't weighted with anxiety. I felt the electric mix of fear and empowerment, fear of the confrontation to come, of Lauren's inevitable reaction, of the emotional fallout, but also the raw clarity that comes from possessing undeniable truth. I understood that nothing would ever be the same, and that the next steps would demand courage, strategy, and resilience. But now, armed with facts, professional validation, and documented evidence, I was no longer a passive participant in a household shadowed by betrayal. I had reached the midpoint, the major revelation. The truth was now unavoidable, and it was real, measurable, and powerful. The choice to speak finally arrived one tense evening, a quiet, stormy night that seemed to mirror the turbulence roiling inside me. I had spent weeks, months even, in careful observation, evidence gathering, and cautious strategizing. But the reality of the situation now demanded action beyond private documentation. The blood tests, the water samples, and the toxicologist's analysis had given me undeniable proof. And with each day that passed, I realized that withholding the truth any longer would only allow Lauren's deception to continue unchallenged. My parents had begun to grasp the seriousness, but their fear of family conflict still hovered in the air, creating a fragile barrier that could crumble at any moment. I knew then that the decision to confront, to speak the truth openly, was a point of no return. Once I did, the dynamics of our household and our relationships would be irreversibly altered. I gathered the documents, notes, and lab reports, placing them neatly in a folder. Every page represented not only the scientific verification of my suspicions, but also the accumulation of sleepless nights, quiet panic, and relentless determination. I reviewed the timeline I had created, linking symptoms to suspicious incidents and correlating water consumption patterns to toxic spikes. This evidence, meticulously recorded, had grown into a comprehensive record that even the most skeptical observer could not dispute. Holding it in my hands, I felt a mix of fear, rage, and resolute clarity. The fear stemmed from the confrontation itself, the potential backlash from Lauren, the emotional turbulence in my parents, and the unknown repercussions of finally speaking out. The rage was directed at the betrayal, the months of illness, the quiet, suffocating manipulation that had invaded every corner of my home. And the clarity came from knowing that truth, once presented with irrefutable evidence, was a power I could no longer ignore. I called my parents into the living room, the folder resting on the coffee table between us. My voice, though steady, carried the weight of the past months. Mom, Dad, I can't stay silent anymore. I have evidence that proves what I've suspected all along. My health has been deliberately endangered. This isn't just about me anymore. This is about safety and honesty in this family. Their faces betrayed shock, worry, and disbelief, but the calm weight of my determination forced them into a silent acknowledgement. Lauren has always remained poised, her expression neutral, yet subtly charged with tension. I could sense the calculations running behind her eyes, the mental strategy to counteract the sudden exposure of her carefully hidden actions. She was no longer untouchable. She knew it, and every subtle gesture she made reflected that awareness. I began presenting the evidence systematically, starting with my meticulously logged symptoms, the dates and times of each incident, and the correlations I had drawn to water consumption patterns. I showed the photographs of bottles I had prepared, the sealed samples I had collected, and the toxicologist analysis confirming the presence of a harmful substance in both my blood and the household water. As I laid out each point, I could see the tension in my parents' posture shift, their initial fear giving way to recognition, and finally, reluctant acceptance. Lauren's face remained controlled, but I could sense the tightening of her jaw, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the first cracks in the calm facade she had maintained for months. The room was silent for a long, suffocating moment after I finished. My parents absorbed the information, finally confronting the gravity of the situation they had tried to ignore. The tension was almost unbearable, the air heavy with unspoken words and the weight of months of denial. I realized then that speaking the truth wasn't just about confronting Lauren. It was about dismantling a culture of silence that had allowed harm to continue unchecked. The choice to speak had shifted that dynamic entirely. I was no longer a passive observer or a cautious victim. I was an active participant demanding accountability, armed with evidence and unwavering resolve.
Lauren's first response was measured, almost casual, but it carried a subtle edge. She attempted to cast doubt on the findings, suggesting procedural errors, external contamination, or coincidences. Her voice was calm, but every word was carefully chosen to sow uncertainty. I anticipated this. I had prepared for the psychological counterplay, the attempts to destabilize me with rationalizations and distractions. I responded point by point, using the meticulous documentation I had compiled to dismantle each of her claims. The more I spoke, the more I realized that the evidence I held was not only protective, but empowering. It validated my experience and created an unassailable foundation for action. By the end of the evening, the tension had reached a pivotal moment. Lauren, confronted with irrefutable proof, finally allowed a flicker of unease to escape her carefully maintained composure. My parents, previously torn between fear and denial, now understood that the situation could not be ignored. The choice to speak had not been easy. It carried emotional risk, potential retaliation, and the possibility of family fracture. But it had opened a path toward justice, accountability, and the restoration of safety in my own home. The air felt charged, as though the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Sitting alone later that night, I reflected on the decision I had made. Speaking the truth had not erased fear, nor had it eliminated the challenges that lay ahead, but it had solidified my resolve. I had crossed a threshold. The secret that had silently poisoned my life was now public within my family, no longer hidden in shadows or doubt. I felt the weight of responsibility, yes, but also a profound sense of liberation. The act of speaking had transformed me from a cautious observer into an agent of truth, someone who could no longer be silenced or manipulated. The journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in months, I felt the faint glimmer of control and hope. The confrontation that followed Emily's declaration was nothing short of a storm. Lauren's subtle manipulations escalated into overt challenges, her calm facade now layered with tension, defiance, and barely restrained hostility. It began the morning after the truth had been spoken, with her entering the kitchen and deliberately knocking over a sealed bottle of water, sending a trickle across the counter and onto the floor. She looked at me, her eyes sharp and calculating, a faint smirk playing across her lips. "You really think this proves anything?" she said, her voice deceptively casual. I felt the surge of anger and fear rise in my chest, but I forced myself to remain composed, taking careful note of her behavior while resisting the urge to react impulsively. I had anticipated psychological games, subtle intimidation, and attempts to destabilize me, and this was only the opening salvo. Over the next several days, the confrontation intensified. Lauren began monitoring my movements more closely, often entering rooms before I arrived or lingering in doorways as if to observe my actions. She would comment casually on my routines, my diet, my sleep patterns, using seemingly innocent words to insinuate control and watchfulness. The tension in the house became almost unbearable. Every glance carried meaning, every silence a calculated pause loaded with threat. I documented each incident meticulously, understanding that these patterns of behavior could serve as corroborating evidence of her deliberate attempts to intimidate me. It was psychological warfare, subtle but relentless.
and it tested my patience, resilience, and resolve in ways I had never imagined. One evening, Lauren attempted a more direct form of confrontation. She cornered me in the hallway, her stance deliberate, almost predatory. "You're making this bigger than it is," she said, her voice low but edged with menace. "Maybe the test was wrong. Maybe you're reading too much into it." Her words were carefully designed to instill doubt, but I refused to falter. I calmly referenced the lab results, the blood tests, and the toxicologist's analysis, reiterating that the evidence was clear, objective, and indisputable. The intensity of her gaze and the subtle flare of frustration in her expression told me that the impact of my confrontation was real. She had counted on silence, denial, and subtle manipulation to maintain control, and now, with the truth laid bare, her power was slipping. As the days progressed, the mounting pressure from Lauren became more pronounced. She began leaving objects in inconvenient places, altering food arrangements, and subtly interfering with my daily routines, each action calibrated to disrupt and unsettle me. My parents, while supportive, were still cautious, their fear of escalation evident in their occasional hesitations to intervene. I recognized the delicate balance I had to maintain, confronting the manipulations without provoking uncontrolled retaliation, documenting every interaction, and preserving my own mental and physical well-being. It was exhausting, a constant strain that required vigilance, strategy, and an unwavering focus on the ultimate goal of exposing the truth fully and safely. Amid the tension, I continued to seek professional advice. Megan helped me arrange additional consultations with legal and medical experts, ensuring that every step I took was backed by authority and evidence. The toxicologist advised on monitoring potential continued exposure, while a lawyer provided guidance on documentation, legal options, and protective measures. I began compiling a comprehensive dossier that combined personal logs, photographic evidence, lab results, and expert commentary, a body of proof that could not be dismissed, rationalized, or ignored. The act of creating this dossier, while laborious, became empowering. It was a tangible representation of my agency, a counterweight to the psychological pressure Lauren sought to exert.
Despite my preparation, the confrontation escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Lauren's behavior grew bolder, her tactics shifting from subtle intimidation to more deliberate interference. She would rearrange items in the kitchen to provoke accidental contamination, linger near workspaces to unsettle me, and even engage in casual conversations loaded with veiled threats or insidious humor. Each action was calculated, a combination of defiance, aggression, and strategic manipulation. The atmosphere in the house became almost unbearable, a pressure cooker of tension and psychological strain. Yet with each encounter, my resolve strengthened. I was no longer simply reacting to her tactics. I was analyzing, documenting, and anticipating her moves, turning the confrontation into a carefully navigated process of truth-seeking and evidence accumulation. There were moments, of course, when exhaustion and fear threatened to overwhelm me. Nights were sleepless, with the constant mental inventory of potential threats and the replaying of confrontations over and over in my mind. My body ached from stress and lingering symptoms, and my emotional reserves were taxed to their limits. But each time I wavered, I reminded myself of the objective proof in my hands, the toxicologist's validation, and the knowledge that the truth was undeniable. This conviction became my anchor, allowing me to endure the mounting pressure and remain vigilant in the face of Lauren's escalating tactics. By the end of the week, it was clear that the confrontation had reached a critical point. Lauren's subtle psychological maneuvers could no longer conceal the reality. Her deception had been exposed, her manipulations documented, and her influence over the household waning. The mounting pressure, while exhausting and intimidating, had the effect of clarifying the situation. The truth was no longer hidden, and every attempt she made to obscure it only served to reinforce the evidence against her.
I had survived the psychological storm, strengthened by my preparation, documentation, and unwavering commitment to exposing the reality of her actions. The confrontation had transformed from a passive struggle into a deliberate, strategic engagement, a testing ground for resilience, courage, and the power of undeniable truth. The aftermath of confronting Lauren brought a darkness I had not anticipated, a suffocating sense of isolation and fear that seemed to infiltrate every corner of my life. Once I had spoken the truth and presented undeniable evidence, I expected clarity, perhaps even relief. But instead, the consequences hit with a crushing force. My parents, caught between support for me and the fear of family fracture, began to waver in their actions. They loved me, but the burden of having acknowledged the truth also weighed heavily on them. Small disagreements became tense exchanges, their eyes darting toward Lauren in unspoken fear, their voices tight with caution. I felt simultaneously vindicated and alienated. The knowledge that I had been poisoned by my own sister and the months of manipulation that accompanied it were confirmed, yet the emotional fallout was heavier than I had imagined. Lauren's reaction escalated in ways that made the house almost unlivable. Her passive-aggressive maneuvers had turned into more direct intimidation, though she still masked them under the guise of everyday behavior. She would linger silently in rooms, her gaze following me in a way that set my nerves on edge. Sometimes she would rearrange my personal items, tamper with my food, or subtly interfere with my access to safe drinking water. Each act a quiet reminder that she could still assert control if she wanted to. It was an exhausting, relentless psychological siege, and I realized that even though I had the evidence, my immediate environment remained hostile. I could no longer relax in my own home. The threat was tangible, constant, and oppressive, and it left me physically and emotionally drained. Worse, the weight of betrayal and exposure carried a deep emotional toll. Even though I had undeniable proof of her poisoning, the fact that she was my sister, someone I had once trusted, made the situation unbearably complex. Memories of shared childhood moments, family holidays, and small acts of care collided violently with the knowledge of her deliberate, calculated actions against me. I experienced waves of grief and anger, oscillating unpredictably. Some moments I felt overwhelming rage, picturing the subtle ways she had endangered my life. In others, a crushing sadness, mourning the loss of trust and the familial bonds that could never be fully restored. Sleep became elusive, and even mundane tasks felt weighted with tension, as though the very fabric of my daily life had been poisoned along with the water I had once taken for granted. I found myself second-guessing even the smallest decisions, afraid that any misstep could provoke further retaliation. The psychological warfare Lauren waged was subtle but effective, and the uncertainty about what she might do next gnawed at me constantly. Should I drink water from a sealed bottle? Could I leave the house unattended? Would she attempt to manipulate my parents into doubting the evidence? The mental toll was significant. I realized that the consequences of speaking out extended far beyond confrontation. The act of exposing the truth had triggered a chain reaction of fear, retaliation, and instability that pervaded every aspect of life. I felt the isolation sharply, as if the world that I had known had fractured and left me navigating a minefield of distrust and tension.
The emotional weight reached its peak when I faced a particularly brutal confrontation. Lauren, aware that her actions had been exposed, lashed out in subtle but cutting ways, questioning my memory, casting doubt on my interpretations, and using every conversational tactic to unsettle me psychologically. The house, once a place of familiarity, now felt like a battleground. Even my parents' cautious presence offered limited comfort. Their fear of escalation made them hesitant to intervene directly. I realized that though the truth was mine and I had undeniable proof, the immediate consequences of speaking it were severe. The clarity and validation I had felt moments after receiving the blood test were now overshadowed by the harsh reality of daily, persistent opposition and isolation. Despite the weight of these pressures, I clung to the knowledge that exposing the truth had been necessary. Each act of intimidation, each subtle challenge from Lauren only reinforced the importance of documenting everything meticulously. I began journaling with even greater detail, noting every interaction, every suspicious movement, every emotional reaction. These records were not only practical, they were therapeutic, a way to maintain a sense of control in an environment where almost everything felt uncertain. They reminded me that while the immediate aftermath was punishing, it was also temporary. The truth was undeniable, and that fact provided a backbone of resilience even in moments of despair. I also leaned heavily on Megan during this period, speaking to her multiple times a day, sharing fears, frustrations, and observations. Her voice became a lifeline, a steady source of perspective that reminded me I was not alone in navigating this crisis. She encouraged me to focus on facts, on evidence, and on measurable steps toward resolution, rather than being overwhelmed by the emotional onslaught. I began to understand that this dark night of the soul phase, the emotional nadir, was a necessary crucible. It forced me to confront the full extent of betrayal, fear, and emotional fallout. And in doing so, it prepared me for the next phase, the final push toward exposing the truth publicly with authority and clarity. By the end of that week, I recognized that though the immediate consequences were harsh, the experience had also strengthened my resilience. I had survived intimidation, isolation, and emotional turmoil. I had maintained my composure, meticulously documented every detail, and prepared a body of undeniable evidence that could withstand scrutiny. The sense of hopelessness and fear had not vanished entirely, but it had shifted into a determined resolve. I understood that the confrontation was far from over, but I was no longer the overwhelmed, uncertain target of manipulation. I had faced the lowest point, and the lessons it taught me about resilience, strategy, and courage would guide me through the next decisive stage of exposing the truth and reclaiming safety and justice. The final push came quietly at first, but its impact was monumental. I knew that private confrontation had its limits. The truth needed a stage where it could no longer be ignored, where evidence, documentation, and professional validation would collide to make denial impossible. I arranged a formal meeting with my parents, Lauren, and the toxicologist, ensuring that every piece of evidence was meticulously organized, presented with clarity, and verified by expert authority. The air in the house that morning was electric, tense with anticipation. Lauren, as always, attempted calmness, but the subtle lines of anxiety around her eyes betrayed the realization that the controlled environment she had relied on for months was slipping from her grasp. Every glance, every measured gesture screamed that the stakes had shifted irreversibly. I began the meeting by calmly recounting the timeline of events, from the earliest moments of unexplained symptoms to the present when professional evidence confirmed deliberate poisoning. I presented my meticulously documented logs, the photographic evidence of water samples, and the toxicologist's comprehensive report. Each page, each chart, each notation carried weight, transforming what had once been suspicion into a concrete, undeniable record. I spoke steadily, deliberately, choosing my words with precision to avoid emotional entanglement while allowing the raw truth to resonate. My parents listened in near silence, absorbing the weight of the proof in front of them, their previous hesitation giving way to the gravity of the moment. Lauren, predictably, attempted her first wave of denial, claiming errors, contamination, and coincidence. Her voice remained measured, but the undercurrent of panic was visible in the slight tremor of her hands and the tightness around her jaw. I countered each claim with documentation and expert validation, leaving no room for ambiguity. The toxicologist, present as a neutral authority, confirmed the methodology, results, and implications of the tests. Her statements carried a finality that could not be disputed. The substance in my blood matched the toxic agent in the water. The concentration levels indicated deliberate administration over time, and the patterns of exposure correlated precisely with the documented symptoms. The room felt charged, a silent tension that underscored the clash between undeniable fact and desperate denial. For the first time, the confrontation became public within the family in a formal, undeniable sense. Every claim Lauren attempted to make was systematically dismantled by evidence, professional testimony, and meticulous record keeping. I realized in that moment that truth, once documented and verified, had an authority that fear, manipulation, and emotional control could not match. Her mask of calm authority began to crack, revealing frustration, fear, and the realization that her carefully maintained deception could no longer survive the scrutiny of fact. My parents, initially caught between protection and denial, now sat with faces etched in comprehension, their previous hesitation dissolving as they witnessed the evidence in full, undeniable clarity.
The room remained silent for a long, tense pause after the toxicologist summarized her findings. I felt the weight of the moment, the culmination of months of observation, documentation, and emotional endurance. This was not merely about proving wrongdoing, it was about reclaiming control over my life, restoring personal safety, and demanding accountability within the family structure. Every carefully measured step I had taken, logging symptoms, securing evidence, consulting experts, now converged into a decisive moment where the truth could not be disputed, where denial no longer held sway. The finality of professional validation transformed fear and tension into empowerment, both for me and for my parents. Lauren's reactions grew increasingly desperate as the meeting continued. She tried subtle manipulations, inserting doubt into casual comments, questioning the legitimacy of documentation, and attempting to shift attention away from her actions. Yet each maneuver met with immediate factual counterpoints, leaving her attempts increasingly ineffective. The more she resisted, the clearer her culpability became. I realized that confrontation in this formal, documented setting had a power that private arguments could never achieve. Evidence presented under authority and scrutiny created a dynamic where manipulation and denial could no longer dominate. By the time the meeting concluded, the balance had shifted decisively. My parents, armed with understanding and professional confirmation, had aligned clearly with me, acknowledging the reality of the situation and the necessity of accountability. Lauren, stripped of subtlety and faced with irrefutable truth, was left with limited options: continued denial in the face of overwhelming evidence, or acknowledgement of her actions and the consequences that would follow. The transformation was striking. A household once governed by manipulation, secrecy, and quiet intimidation had shifted into a space where accountability, transparency, and truth dominated. I felt an immense sense of relief, though tempered by the awareness that the battle was not fully concluded. The immediate confrontation had been successful. The truth had been presented and validated, and the psychological hold Lauren had maintained had been significantly weakened. Yet, the process of ongoing accountability, protection, and rebuilding trust would require diligence, strategy, and continued vigilance. I allowed myself a brief moment to acknowledge the culmination of months of effort, the triumph of evidence over fear, and the power of truth to disrupt manipulation. That evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this climactic moment. The months of careful documentation, strategic observation, and professional consultation had transformed me from a cautious victim into an empowered advocate for my own safety and for accountability. Speaking the truth, confronting manipulation, and presenting undeniable proof had shifted not only the dynamics within my family, but also my own sense of agency. The final push had achieved its goal. The truth was no longer hidden, no longer disputable, and no longer confined to private suspicion. The moment of confrontation had crystallized the principle that evidence, courage, and persistence could dismantle deception even when perpetrated by those closest to you.
The days following the climactic confrontation were a study in recalibration and fragile restoration. With the truth formally laid bare and undeniable evidence in hand, the household began a slow, painstaking process of adjusting to a new reality. The tension that had gripped every corner of our home, the subtle and not so subtle manipulations that had colored every interaction, gradually began to dissipate, replaced with a tentative sense of order and cautious relief. My parents, now fully aligned with me, began to assert their own boundaries more clearly, enforcing rules and routines that prioritized honesty, safety, and accountability. Their previous hesitance had been replaced with clarity. The damage had been done, but it could no longer be hidden or denied. Lauren's response in the aftermath was telling. Stripped of her usual maneuvers and confronted with irrefutable proof, she initially resisted, attempting to downplay her actions or rationalize them. But with professional validation, documentation, and the firm stance of my parents supporting me, her defenses eroded quickly. The manipulations that previously had gone unchecked were now openly countered, leaving her options limited. Gradually, she began to show signs of acknowledgement, whether forced by circumstance or a reluctant recognition of reality. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time in months, she was no longer in control of the narrative. The invisible dominance she had maintained dissolved under the weight of evidence, transparency, and accountability. The sense of vindication that accompanied this shift was profound. For so long, I had lived in a haze of doubt, uncertainty, and fear, questioning my own perceptions and enduring subtle forms of intimidation. The months of documenting symptoms, collecting samples, and consulting experts had been exhausting and emotionally taxing, yet they had led to this decisive moment. Every headache, wave of nausea, and night of restless anxiety now had a tangible explanation, and every act of subtle intimidation from Lauren could be contextualized and countered. This vindication was not merely personal, it was practical, offering a foundation for restored safety and clarity in daily life. I also felt a deep sense of relief that the burden of secrecy was lifted. Keeping the poisoning hidden had weighed heavily on me, forcing me to navigate every interaction with caution, suspicion, and vigilance. The act of revealing the truth, combined with the undeniable evidence, unshackled me from that constant mental vigilance. I could breathe more freely, drink water without hesitation, and move through my home without the ever-present awareness of subtle threats. This newfound freedom was empowering, a tangible transformation from the fear and uncertainty that had previously dominated my life.
Yet the restoration of equilibrium was not without its challenges. Family dynamics had been irrevocably altered, trust fractured, and the road to genuine reconciliation required time, effort, and continued vigilance. My parents were navigating the difficult balance of supporting me while also attempting to maintain family cohesion, a delicate dance that required patience and understanding. Lauren's presence, now constrained by accountability measures and open acknowledgement of her actions, still carried a tension that could flare unexpectedly. The equilibrium was new and fragile, requiring conscious effort from all parties to maintain. Professional guidance continued to play a key role during this period. The toxicologist provided follow-up advice, monitoring ongoing exposure risks, and ensuring that any remaining environmental hazards were mitigated. Legal consultations helped clarify boundaries, documentation requirements, and protective measures, ensuring that accountability could be maintained without escalating conflict unnecessarily. Megan remained a steady source of guidance and support, helping me navigate both the emotional and practical aspects of restoring equilibrium. Her encouragement reinforced the importance of maintaining perspective, focusing on facts, and nurturing resilience in the face of lingering challenges. As the days turned into weeks, the household began to settle into this new reality. Morning routines became predictable, meals were shared without fear or suspicion, and conversations, though still cautious at times, were grounded in transparency. The atmosphere, once charged with subtle hostility, manipulation, and fear, began to lighten incrementally. The shift was noticeable not only in interactions, but also in my own perception of safety, control, and empowerment. The equilibrium was imperfect, but it was a foundation upon which healing, accountability, and personal agency could be built. Emotionally, I felt the profound impact of having my experience validated.
Months of doubt and fear had been replaced by confidence in the truth, a tangible sense of control and clarity in my interactions with family. The courage it took to speak out, gather evidence, and persist in the face of intimidation now yielded a profound sense of accomplishment. I recognized that the process had transformed me, reinforcing my resilience, sharpening my awareness, and confirming my ability to navigate high-stakes, emotionally charged situations effectively. The validation extended beyond personal satisfaction. It created a framework for ensuring ongoing accountability and protection within the household. Perhaps most importantly, this period of resolution underscored the transformative power of truth. Lies, manipulation, and covert aggression had dominated for months, creating an environment of fear and uncertainty. By presenting evidence, documenting meticulously, and involving professional validation, the truth had asserted itself in a way that could not be denied. The resulting shift in dynamics demonstrated that transparency, courage, and persistence were not abstract virtues. They were practical tools for restoring safety, clarity, and empowerment. By the end of this phase, I felt a cautious but genuine sense of accomplishment and relief. The equilibrium was fragile, but the foundation had been firmly established. Accountability had been enforced, manipulation curtailed, and personal safety restored. I could finally envision a path forward, one where vigilance, preparation, and the courage to confront deception allowed for genuine restoration and stability. In the quiet moments of reflection, I understood that this resolution was not just about immediate vindication. It was about reclaiming my life, establishing boundaries, and ensuring that truth and safety could coexist as the guiding principles of our family dynamic. The weeks after the resolution became a period of profound reflection and quiet empowerment. For so long, my life had been dominated by subtle threats, manipulation, and the silent terror of knowing I had been deliberately harmed by someone I once trusted above all else. Each day, the consequences of Lauren's actions had pressed heavily on me, from the physical toll of exposure to the emotional weight of betrayal. Now, with accountability established and my family aligned with the truth, a sense of liberation began to unfold. It was not instantaneous, nor was it complete, but the oppressive cloud that had hung over our household for months was lifting, leaving space for clarity, safety, and the possibility of rebuilding both trust and personal confidence. I found myself approaching daily life with a renewed sense of vigilance, coupled with empowerment. Tasks that had once been fraught with anxiety, drinking water, preparing meals, interacting with family members, now carried a cautious confidence. I had internalized lessons from the months of documentation, observation, and professional consultation, which now served as tools of personal agency rather than instruments of stress. The awareness that I had survived manipulation, documented proof, and faced intimidation while maintaining composure reinforced a quiet, resilient strength. I recognized that the ordeal had changed me, fear could no longer dominate my decisions, and the knowledge that I had acted decisively and successfully imbued me with a sense of competence and self-trust that was transformative. My relationship with my parents also began to evolve in this period of restoration. No longer constrained by the fear of denial or the pressure of silence, conversations became more open, reflective, and intentional. We discussed not only the events that had transpired, but also the lessons learned about trust, boundaries, and the importance of maintaining vigilance against manipulation. My parents' alignment with me created a protective network that reinforced safety and fostered mutual understanding. While the scars of the ordeal remained, the emotional distance and uncertainty that had characterized previous interactions were replaced with clarity, shared responsibility, and a cautious but genuine sense of familial solidarity.
Lauren, too, existed in this new landscape differently than before. The formal confrontation, documentation, and professional validation had imposed a framework of accountability she could not escape. Her movements, once carefully orchestrated to maintain subtle dominance and psychological control, were now constrained by the undeniable presence of truth. While tension remained, it was no longer the suffocating, unpredictable weight that had previously dominated daily life. Her awareness that any deviation from accountability would be immediately recognized and documented created an invisible but effective barrier, allowing me to operate with a sense of safety and control previously unattainable. The experience also reshaped my understanding of personal empowerment and the power of evidence. I had learned firsthand that courage alone was insufficient when facing manipulation, deceit, and covert harm. Preparation, meticulous documentation, and professional support were equally essential. The combination of these elements created a robust framework for asserting truth, protecting oneself, and enforcing accountability in high-stakes, emotionally complex situations. The ordeal, while traumatic, had imparted practical tools and psychological resilience that would remain with me indefinitely, forming a foundation for navigating challenges in both personal and professional spheres. Beyond the practical implications, there was a symbolic transformation as well. Each time I entered the kitchen or reached for a water bottle without fear, each conversation with my parents conducted openly and calmly, each moment of reflection without the oppressive anxiety of potential sabotage, I felt a reclamation of space, autonomy, and peace. The environment that had once been toxic, suffused with the quiet tension of manipulation and hidden danger, was now transformed into a space where truth governed interactions and safety was reaffirmed daily. This shift, subtle yet profound, marked the completion of the journey from victimhood to agency, from uncertainty to empowerment. In the quiet moments of reflection, I also recognized the broader significance of my experience. While deeply personal, the ordeal illuminated universal truths about courage, accountability, and the transformative power of exposing hidden harm. The process of documenting evidence, confronting deception, and asserting boundaries is not unique to my situation. It is a blueprint for reclaiming control in circumstances where manipulation, betrayal, or covert harm threaten well-being. I had become not only a survivor, but also an example of how perseverance, preparation, and principled action could restore equilibrium and enforce justice in even the most intimate and challenging contexts. As life began to normalize, I also found ways to channel my experience into positive action. I initiated conversations with friends and extended family about recognizing subtle signs of manipulation, safeguarding personal safety, and the importance of evidence when confronting wrongdoing. I shared insights on emotional resilience, strategic preparation, and the critical importance of consulting professionals when necessary. These conversations, conducted with care and discretion, became a means of transforming personal trauma into broader empowerment, ensuring that the lessons learned would not only benefit myself, but also others who might face similar hidden threats. Finally, I allowed myself to celebrate the transformation that had occurred. The fear, uncertainty, and tension that had defined my life for months were replaced by clarity, agency, and a sense of purpose. I could reflect on the journey with pride, the meticulous preparation, the courage to speak, the resilience in facing intimidation, and the eventual triumph of undeniable truth. The ordeal had not only restored my safety, but also fundamentally reshaped my sense of self, reinforcing that courage combined with strategy and evidence could overcome even the most insidious forms of betrayal. In the end, the experience became a testament to personal strength and the enduring power of truth. The home, once a place of covert danger, was now a space of transparency and accountability. I had reclaimed not only physical safety, but also emotional agency, transforming fear into empowerment, vulnerability into vigilance, and deception into clarity. The journey had been arduous, but it had culminated in a profound transformation. A new life, purpose, and identity grounded in resilience, courage, and the unassailable power of truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.